you have said, of course, on Twitter that you think that this is a knock for federalism. But you've heard the arguments that in favor of what the center has done, and now the center has also petitioned the Supreme Court before, presumably, you've asked for a review. Your comments?
Okay, I'll answer all your questions, Barkha, but just step back for a minute. Of course, I made the preliminary point that this is the stupendously weird act of a poor, graceless loser. Before the ink is dry, you attempt to change the rules of the game by an ordinance. But just step back and ask yourself the question. You all agree that an ordinance or even an act, if it ever becomes an act, cannot change the constitutional principle, correct? An act cannot change, only a constitutional amendment can change constitutional principles. This bizarre act seeks to change constitutional principles. Now, all that the CJI said is to quote the Constitution, which gives Parliament the power to enact laws. For even Delhi, even for List 2, even areas where Delhi can enact law, Parliament can enact law. Nowhere is it said or can be ever said that the basic architecture, intent and rationale for the creation of Delhi's constitutional status can be nullified by an act of Parliament or ordinance. Just consider. Why did you create Delhi at all? You have to step back. Why did you give Delhi a special constitutional status with 239A? Why did you give it autonomy? Why did you say that barring 3 areas, there shall be no powers? It was because parliamentary democracy, federalism, and decentralization, all larger constitutional principles, not statutory principles. Federalism has in fact been held to be part of the basic structure, animated that underpinning. Number 2, that underpinning of constitutional principle has other constitutional principles. The civil service will always be answerable to the political executive, is another basic constitutional principle. Have you ever heard that you are administering a territory, I am the civil service, and I answer to X, but you are supposed to administer it? It's never done. That's why it's answerable. Number 3, this judgment 2 weeks ago gives the civil service entire power in Part 14 of the Constitution, another constitutional principle, which has, as you know, 309, removal, suspension, punishment, all of that civil service power to the NCT government. So there are principles of autonomy, federalism, the very rationale for creating Delhi. You might as well have created Delhi as a national territory. You had no obligation to create Delhi as almost a separate state. Delhi is certainly not a union territory. It's a union territory plus. It is just short of a state because it has -3 powers. Now, a statute cannot negate that fundamental spirit of the entire 239AA. You have to repeal 239AA. And what you are now saying is that the sentence of the Constitution, which 239AA says, that you can pass laws. So the Chief Justice said nothing new in that line. He is only quoting the Constitution. Parliament can pass laws for the NCT. But that does not mean that you can completely change the constitutional underpinning of the system.
Hang on, I need to clarify that. Let's first bring up on our screen that particular paragraph that is being quoted all over the social media by supporters of the center. And you can see it on your screen, whereby they say that the Chief Justice himself said, however, if Parliament enacts a law granting executive power on any subject which is within the domain of the NCTD, the executive power of the Lieutenant Governor shall be modified to the extent, and so it goes on. Now, talk about this. Are you saying that this is not in reference to the basic principle of the Constitution, which is that the bureaucracy cannot be above the elected government?
All the principles which can be done, let's take the maximum which can be done by an act. That is the limitation of an act of Parliament. I'm assuming the ordinance to be an act at the moment. So assume that an act of Parliament can do everything which an act can do. It is common ground that an act cannot affect any constitutional principle. It is common ground that an act cannot decimate, dilute, or undermine any constitutional underpinning. Now, what are the constitutional principles? 1, federalism, decentralization, answerability of the civil service to the political executive, autonomy in Delhi. If there is no such principle, then 239, can this act, now the para you read, can this act say, we hereby dilute, decimate, or overrule 239A itself? That's also legislature saying so. It can't, because 239A is in the constitution. Now, equally, if you can't touch 239AA, you cannot touch the entire constitutional architecture of 239AA, which must have a large measure of autonomy in Delhi. Otherwise, you might as well make Delhi a national territory of the center. And let me tell you, I have very grave doubts whether Parliament will at all pass it. What they've done is Barkha only to buy time. And that is why they're living on borrowed time. I have no doubt that, and one more thing, Barkha,
Yeah.
a judgment you cannot pass a law saying judgment is nullified. The judgment's basis can be removed, and then the judgment will not apply. You cannot remove the basis of this judgment and indeed the 2018 judgment, because large parts of that basis are based on constitutional principle, not on statutory principle. So you need a constitutional amendment. And if you have the guts, please pass a 2/3 constitutional amendment.
You're saying that the Chief Justice's comment does not cover the basic structure of the Constitution, and the basic structure of the Constitution is underpins federalism and underpins the fact that the bureaucracy must report to the elected government.
Also, it does not change, you're right what you said, but also it does not affect the basic architecture of 239AA itself.
Explain for our viewers, explain to people who are not lawyers, what is 239AA?
239AA was created, there's a whole part in the Constitution which has many sections, 239A, AA, etc., etc. I won't get into legalese.
Yeah.
Now, the debate there was that there were union territories like Puducherry, there were other union territories, Daman, Diu, etc. One part of these constitutional provisions kept them as union territories, which meant that they were administered directly by the central government. Are you with me?
Yes, I am.
The central government was the government for that state. So when you had Kiran Bedi running Puducherry, it was the central government running Puducherry. When you had somebody else running Daman Diu, you had that person, the central government's man, running it, like an LG. You then created 239AA, which is a separate architecture for Delhi. It is unique in being the only non-state territory which is equally not a union territory. Delhi is not a union territory. It was given a unique constitutional status by 239AA. Now, before you reach the basic structure of the constitution, you have to reckon with the basic structure and architecture of 239AA itself. 239AA architecture is, this shall be a special status, this shall not be a union territory merely. It is not a state, but it is not a state only to the extent of 3 areas. And it is underpinned, this reason we are giving you 239AA is federalism, autonomy, answerability to the political executive, administration by the political executive, not by a central government, not by the LG, the principle of parliamentary democracy itself, federalism, decentralization, parliamentary democracy itself. What? Now, just tell you one thing. What is parliamentary? Do you have elections in Puducherry? You will have elections in Puducherry where the electorate does not elect in the same way as the 70 seats electorate elects in Delhi. There is a different architecture there. And by an act of parliament or an ordinance, you cannot simply, repeal or, nullify 239A. Also, you cannot repeal and nullify the larger concepts you mentioned, federalism, etc., which is part of the basic structure of the constitution.
What if Parliament were to move a constitutional amendment to actually change the powers by which Delhi is organized?
Actually, that is the powers, correct.
But the details. Yeah,
absolutely
Parliament
right.
do that, right?
You are absolutely right. Actually, that is the only correct way to do it. I'm not saying they should do it. I'm not saying they will do it. But that is absolutely 100% bang on the point. You should do it. That is the only way you can do. Now, what you can do in your methodology, Barkha, just now which you mentioned, you can repeal 239AA itself.